Okay, hello and welcome everybody. This is, as you might have guessed, the UC Center Sacramento Weekly Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our in-person audience and also our Zoom audience. Today we're taking a detour from our 22-23 theme of climate change, public health infrastructure, and housing and homelessness to focus on a different issue, that is data. So now in 2023, people have access to more data than ever before, but data doesn't directly translate into information, and nor does information translate into knowledge. And finally, knowledge is pretty difficult to convert into wisdom, which is what you really need in order to make sound decisions, whether that's in academia or in government. But in both places, there's kind of a paradox because the public pays for data, whether it be through agencies that fund scientific research or support of government agencies and departments, yet the public doesn't reap the full benefits of the data because the data are siloed or hard to access or just otherwise inscrutable. So how do we move towards greater transparency and usability of the data that we're paying for? To address this question and more, we're pleased to have two distinguished experts. Christine Borgman is Distinguished Research Professor and former Presidential Chair in Information Studies at UCLA. Her work focuses on scientific data practices and information policy. She's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the author of over 250 articles and 3 books, including Big Data, Little Data, No Data, and a title I like even a little bit more, From Gutenberg to the Global Information Infrastructure, Access to Information in a Networked World. Dr. Borgman holds degrees in math, information science, and communication, and she's lectured widely around the world, so we're very pleased that you brought yourself to Sacramento here today. She is joined by Joy Bonaguro. Ms. Bonaguro is Chief Data Officer for the state of California, where she served since January 2020, working within the Office of Data and Innovation, which for those who like inside government baseball, resulted from the merger of CalData with the Office of Digital Innovation. Previously, she served as Head of Systems and Data at CoreLight Incorporated, and before that, she was Chief Data Officer for the City and County of San Francisco, where she was responsible for accelerating data use across 30,000 employees and 50+ lines of business. She scaled up a bit as California has, at last count, over 200,000 employees and over 200 agencies and departments. Ms. Bonaguro has a BS in Math and Philosophy from Tulane University and a Master's of Public Policy from the University of California, Berkeley. Without further ado, let's welcome both of these speakers to UC Center Sacramento for what I think will be a very important set of discussions. Thanks.
Thank you. We give Dr. Kravitz credit for an inspired choice of pairing speakers because Joy and I have sort of circled each other in areas for probably the last several decades, thinking about complementary issues, but from different perspectives. So I'm going to talk about research data and give kind of a very broad span of theoretical and policy and foundational issues. And then hers is going much more, what we say, boots on the ground kinds of issues with the state. But I can assure you that for every example she has, I have a counterpart example of the same problems in universities and in science as well. So let me dig in. Brooke wasn't sure what these funny images were. These are several translations of this same book, just to give you a data translation problem to start. Okay. So research data for the public good. At the high level, a good place to start is the requirements by funding agencies and journals that have emerged over the last several decades on requiring people to release the data that go with their grants. And the idea is, if you're going to get money from the public, whether it's in National Science Foundation, NIH, social sciences, humanities, you owe it to the public to give those data back for other people to reuse them. So it makes it easier to reproduce the research, makes the processes more transparent, use them for education, and often to get the article published, you have to release the data to go with it. But that's extremely difficult to do. And some of the ways you could go about it is you can link the data sets to publication, but you have to have a place to put them, like a data archive. And that might be a dedicated archive. If it's medicine, Dr. Kravitz's stuff probably goes in some of the National Institutes of Health databases and other places. But if you're in the humanities, you may not have a good place to put it. So maybe the California Digital Library, part of the UC system, would be a place to put it. But you've got to publish enough information about those data, the protocols, the code books, the software, the algorithms, and so on, to make them useful, and that's expensive and cited, and you can develop instructional materials. So I think it's very hard to put dollar costs on these, but I would say that the process of sharing could cost as much time and effort as getting those data in the first place. I work primarily in the last few years with astronomers, and it takes decades to get these kinds of data. But once you get them, they are important to preserve because they remain useful for a very long time. Now, astronomy is generally divided into ground-based versus space-based, and there's lots of, like, what part of the spectrum you're looking at, was images or spectra, and so on. So the bottom left is a Sloan Digital Sky Survey, an example of that. That's an optical ground-based, funded by National Science Foundation, that only includes a small amount of funding to keep those data. Whereas the Hubble Space Telescope, just like the James Webb, which launched recently, is space-based. That's NASA-funded, and if it's NASA-funded, they do give you money to keep the data. In the middle is the Sophia, the airplane here, and I'm writing a paper with several astronomers on that project. It is a custom-fitted 747 that flies at up to 45,000 feet, and it gets a part of the infrared spectrum, much broader set that you can get from the James Webb. And they took this picture of the center of the Milky Way. And why does it take 20 years to build these things? This custom-developed telescope had to be able to have a door that would open and fly open at 45,000 feet. Think about that. So the door has to open. The telescope has to float on the largest precision ball bearing ever made so that you can lock onto an object near the center of the Milky Way and fly locked onto it for 8 hours with low enough vibration that'll work. This is why it costs $2 billion over 20 years to do these kinds of things. And if you can invest $2 billion, shouldn't we keep those data? So we can use them because they were so hard to get. You want to get as much lifetime out of them as you possibly can. But the difficulty, and this is something that Dr. Kravitz knows very well, is this data sharing policy that was just renewed 20 years on. The first one was in 2003. It came into process of NIH. There's many others for different agencies. But they had one in 2001. Notice all the fine print of trying to find what are data in the first place. That's the real challenge, is are you expected to share the tissue, the blood samples, the slides, the mouse, the piece of the mouse, the cell structure, the DNA, the water samples, the refined data, the processed data, even the data we get off the telescopes goes through many, many different processing pipelines and takes many shapes and forms. It's never really clear what we mean by the data that have to be shared. And there's an entire chapter in this last book of mine about what are data that begins to address what some of those challenges are. Part of that issue is that the data and all this exist within the context of knowledge infrastructures. It's that we are not, it's not, as soon as you take it out of context, it ceases to be very useful. The infrastructure, which this is from a good colleague of ours, Paul Edwards, who's now at Stanford, that we think about these as robust networks of people, artifacts, and institutions that generate, share, and maintain specific knowledge about the human and natural worlds. That's a pretty big umbrella, and it's a moving target, but it's a good way of thinking about the different moving parts of the practices involved, the technical infrastructures, the policy infrastructures, and the governance models, like should the principal investigator be required to save it? Should it be the university? Should it be the funding agency? Who should stand up these archives? Who should take the long haul responsibility for them? Those are the kinds of pieces that are involved here that we try to think about. And again, many stakeholders. I've got references to two articles here that you'll be more easy to see when you look at the slides later. But the first one with Phil Bourne, who was the Chief Data Officer for the National Institutes of Health and is now Dean of Data Science at Virginia. We wrote a piece coming out of that big policy work with the NIH called Why It Takes a Village to Share Research Data. And seeing that within the university, it's very hard to get all the different stakeholders to work together to make those available. It's always pass the buck. It's always somebody else's problem to take responsibility. So the funding agencies push it down to the universities push it down to the individual scientists. The scientists often leave it to the graduate students or even the undergraduate students who end up doing the heavy lifting to make this work. But we would ultimately like many of these data to be available to the general public, but the general public does not necessarily have the expertise, much less the sets of tools, the software, and everything else that's required to make sense of these. So we have many interdependencies here, and let me spend just a few minutes on this slide, because we have some time. People are always kind of focused on acting locally. These are my data, this is my problem, how am I going to keep these available? But it's this global interaction that's the real challenge of, what data to share, to whom and who's going to use it. And whoever built those data tends to think of other people like themselves as the ones who are going to make use of it, where in fact, things like, let me give you an example from the environmental sciences, because I know a number of students here are interested in environmental issues, is the National Snow and Ice Data Center started, I think, maybe 40 years or so ago, looking at, getting very careful, detailed measurements of the depth of certain icebergs. And it was about 20 years of data before they could see enough of the trends to realize how quickly those icebergs were degrading. And suddenly, that set of data became important to a lot of people for whom they were not the least bit designed to interpret. And they ended up doing a very expensive process of going back in, adding new kinds of metadata, new kinds of documentation to basically re-engineer a very expensive long-term database so that it could be used by the IPCC and others. But that's very rarely done. But that's a kind of investment that happens. Intellectual property, that also gets bogged down in universities as well as outside universities, is in areas like engineering and medicine. People think, oh, I've got these, we might get a patent, we might get some money out of them. Let's sit on them for 1, 2, 3, 5 years to see if we can get money out of them, by which time they're no longer very useful. And only a very small percentage of those actually turn out to be worth any kind of money. The domain expertise and the misuses of data are, I think, getting to be increasingly of concern, particularly in environmental areas. One of my former master's students at UCLA is now working on a dissertation at the University of Michigan looking at how both the environmental justice community and the climate deniers are building whole layers of infrastructure on top of government databases of environmental data and cherry-picking them to try to say things that the scientists would not say are what those data are supporting. And the scientists are not going to spend their entire careers refuting every single thing somebody comes up and says, but it says this, it says this. Well, maybe this data point says this, but in the big picture, the big model, that's not what it says. So I think we've got a huge public policy issue in terms of releasing these data, but dealing with what are reliable, valid, trustworthy uses, and as opposed to misuses or even deliberate disuses of some of these data. We do have a fair amount of public policy out there around issues like what should the principles be of making the data available. And the FAIR principles are now 2016, but they took a long time, a lot of consensus work to make those happen. Europe has gone much further in implementing these. They're very deep policy in Europe, whole implementation plans around how you make data findable, how you make them accessible. So findable means you can discover them. That was a question that came up in our discussion with students this morning. Accessible means can you get them in a way that you can run them on, say, whatever computer and software you've got in front of you. Are they interoperable? Can you combine them and use them across spaces? And are they reusable? And every one of those 4 points is itself a major research project to make work. So that's the ideal, is to make your data fair. So if you say fair data, these are the principles to which people are referring. But the reality is a long way from that. If we could really take an Ethernet cable and plug it into the cloud, life would be much simpler in terms of data management. In fact, it's much more like this middle example here of we just need to migrate these data and from square holes and round pegs, and you need a hammer to get them from one to the next. Data migration is, again, an extremely difficult problem when you want to move it from one to the next. How long does it take you to migrate from one laptop to the next? Okay. Put climate models on top of it, and you have an idea of what it's going to take to get from one to the next. Everybody's got old data. I took this picture up at the Mount Wilson Solar Observatory about 5 years ago. I took this one in the back room of the Getty. Everybody's got stuff around. Here's the friendly graduate students who are the real hands-on. And of course, graduate students turn over every 1, 2, 5 years. This is not a long-term continuity of your workforce, okay? And so passing along the knowledge from one to the next is a real challenge, much less passing it on to the general public who's going to make sense of all of it. So let me wrap up with just 2 more slides to give us a big picture here. So building the village, which is the metaphor that Phil Bourne and I used in the data science paper from last year, is that it's really a collective action problem. And it's a policy term. It's also a term used a lot in economics, that it's always somebody else's responsibility. In economics problems, also data are often public goods. You've got a free rider problem where people can come and take data and not give data back in return. And there are a lot of exchange culture issues here. So if we want to think holistically, we want to find ways to distribute the responsibility better among stakeholders, invest in this expertise. My students taking courses in data management, librarianship, and archiving got probably about 5 job offers each. There's plenty of places to move there. And then to reframe the goals in collective terms, University of California arguably can be the most competitive in this space as the funding agency requirements get more stringent about data sharing, if we really stand up and do this the most effectively. We need to fund the commons, we need more public support for those repositories, and we need more exchange nationally, internationally around the best practices, and invest in those sustainable strategies. So let me wrap up on my favorite library. How many of you recognize this library? One, okay, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, okay, which is where that last data was written, was at Oxford, is to think about research data for the public good in at least these 4 ways. Think about the capture. We need to think about common data formats for capture. Some fields like astronomy do have good methods for consistent data capture. Medicine is a kind of a hot mess. Is that fair to say? Yes, our medical faculty agrees about we worked with the craniofacial data people for several years, got a very good dissertation by Ina Pasquetto out of it. They're looking at craniofacial deformities on 4 different model organisms: humans, chimpanzees, mice, and zebrafish. And this group could barely agree on what a face was, much less on what data they could share across them, but they're all working on a very common problem. So we need to think upfront about the capturing in ways that we can reuse them. We need to maintain those knowledge infrastructures, and we need to make investments in stewardship, which is a lot of people. It's a lot of people investments. It's more people investments and technology investments. To exploit, we should think about fair principles, but also invest in the technical and the domain expertise to make those data useful. And lastly, to think about the role of these data in education, creating, accessing, utilizing, and the assess, trust, and interpret. And then just, I think, a last point that's not on the slide, but one that I think came out very powerfully in our discussion with the students earlier this morning, is about the role of data in policy making. Every policy has data in it. And that you're going to be a better policymaker if you understand data and understand the questions about data, if you can argue with data, if you can challenge data as well, because otherwise people are going to bluff you. And data beats no data every time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. We had breakfast this morning, so we've enjoyed chit-chatting and getting to know each other. So yes, echo the thanks for bringing us together. So when I started at the state of California and joined as the chief data officer, I had a bit of a conundrum on my hands, which is, what does a single CDO do for a place so large and vast and complex? And so I spent a lot of time I'm going to turn off that laser pointer, deciding what I should be doing as a chief data officer. And eventually what emerged is a statewide data strategy. And the statewide data strategy is built around the analogy that we need to equip ourselves to navigate the data landscape, which means we need to build the data roads, streamline data access. We need to craft the rules of the road, so improve data management and governance. And then lastly, we need to boost the travelers and spur data use and ability. And so I'm going to briefly unpack each of these one by one. So why do we need to intentionally build our data roads? So in the state of California, we provide many services to different people at different stages in their lives, right? And then we also regulate and monitor many, many, many different parts of the environment. But our data is housed in silos, depending on what department runs the program, depending when they started, depending what technology they bought. And the reason why this data silos matters is because it's like the proverbial elephant in the blind man, right? If you only see part of the problem, how can you solve for the right thing, right? So let's say you're an ed policy person and you have access to ed data. Well, it's an ed problem. What if you're a health person and you're like, you have access to health data? Oh, it's a health problem. Oh, it's a jobs problem. It's, any number of things, right? But when you're not looking at the whole elephant, you could make the wrong policy decisions. And then, so that's why data access matters, but this is often how data access happens at the state. I have this very scientific diagram. So if you happen to know who to contact to get your data, you sort of track them down, you find their name, and you email them. And they sort of tentatively get back to you because their job is something else. It's not to provide you with data. And so you kind of start harassing them. And you follow up again and again. And then maybe they finally sort of turn it over to you. You're like, here it is. Maybe they email it to you in Excel. And they send a second email with the password. It's my favorite. Not a safe way of exchanging data. Or they post it somewhere and you have to download it. And then, you start looking at it and you start to try to understand the data and use it. Maybe you're munching on an Excel. Maybe you're an R person. And you sort of slip into the question death spiral. And this is back and forth. And, they're not always fast to get back to you. And then guess what happens when you have to update that analysis, that report, that recommendation, that policy piece? You repeat the whole thing right? And so what we're trying to do around the data roads is really architect what I call a spectrum of access. So whenever data can just be publicly made, published, open data, we just want to do that, right? Because then everyone can go and hit it, download it, consume it as a API, application programming interface. We talked briefly about those before, but we can't do that with all of our data. Sometimes our data needs to be closed and really protected because maybe it's about individuals, maybe it's about a sensitive security issue, a policing issue, and so that needs to be closed. So what we are looking to do across the state of California is really architect the spectrum of access so all of our departments can use that spectrum in an efficient, effective way. But we also want to do it across the full spectrum of data sources. Earlier today, one of the students asked about private data. A lot of the work that I was just talking about talks about internal data, but we also, download and use data from the census at the federal level, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And each department goes and does that on their own, and maybe they process it in a weird way. Why don't we just process once, use infinitely, right? And back to that common goods piece of data. But then also when we buy data, we also spoke earlier, we bought imagery data for the state of California. Why can't we buy once versus multiple times? And this is a more holistic approach. So, but once we have all that juicy data lying around, we really need to ensure that we craft the rules of the road. And I think this is so much more salient for us in the physical world. And so this is a screenshot of stop signs before 1968. Does anyone know where the US stop sign came from? It was designed in Michigan. And it was it took a long time. It took decades to adopt and make that a standard in the US. And then there was this convention in Vienna, Austria in 1968. This is what stop signs across the world looked like afterwards. My question for you all, when would you want to travel? Does one feel safer? Okay, so these rules of the road are so salient to us in the physical world, but they're kind of missing in our data and digital world quite a bit. And the one thing I found when I went around the state and asked people about our data rules is I got a consistent answer, which is that we are inconsistent. And this became this became very salient during COVID. So I took the liberty of going during COVID to 4 vaccine websites at 4 separate counties that I will never say which ones they were. You could probably find them out if you're bored and diligent. And one of them asked nothing about race and ethnicity. That's option A, not included. Option B, they did ask. They had a drop down for ethnicity, a drop down for race, but it wasn't required. Another county had what I called the scroll forever UI from hell. So this you see 4 options here. There was like 60 options in there, and it would scroll and sort of jump all over the place. And one of the most important things in race ethnicity is like being able to see yourself on the form. One would have struggled to do so. And then the last one, it was required for both, and you could see your options at a glance. And so my silent poll for you all, who do you think had the best data on race and ethnicity? Not included, not required, scroll forever, at a glance. Well, I have my opinions, but what we do know when you rolled up all that data at the state level, we had about 20% missing race ethnicity data. And why does that matter? Well, we were a big question in vaccine rollouts is this happening in an equitable way? Is it hitting all the communities who are disproportionately experiencing COVID and deaths from COVID? Are we vaccinating at comparable rates? So the last strategy, boost the travelers, spur data use and ability. And the way I'm going to talk about this is to sort of walk you through the 3 services we launched just in January, specifically to tackle this. So And it's built around this two-step plan around data maturity. And the first step is get your data house in order. And there's sort of 3 levels here. So level 1, it's a bit facetious. It's the data void, where you can't answer basic questions about programs and services. There isn't really anyone at the state where that's the case, but we have so many departments that experience level 2 data fire drills. And so what happens is, like, you get a phone call. It could come from the governor's office. It could come from the legislature. It could come from the auditor. It could come from a constituent. And the team, like, runs around and tries to pull together that data and answer the question. And, you know, if they have to repeat that fire drill, they might not hit the same number, right? And so what we're trying to do with the first 2 services I'm going to talk about is get every single department to, data on demand, where essentially all the existing data, metrics, key performance indicators, mandatory reports, there's so many legislatively mandated reports in every department, to return consistent and trusted numbers. And so we have 2 services. The first one's called our Analytics Accelerator. And what the Analytics Accelerator is, it's taking this fire drill head on, right? Because behind the scenes of many data teams across the state, this horrific tragedy is unfolding. And so we have these brilliant analysts sort of in their data caves, like chipping away at these various annual, quarterly reporting requirements. And much of their time and effort is manual and laborious. And the sort of common pattern is that, you know, somewhere, a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet spits out, you know, and they get it, and then they, like, do horrible, violent things to it in Excel, like torture the data in Excel. And then at the end, out pops up a PDF report, sometimes hundreds of pages long. You're like, eyes watering. And once in a while, they'll, like, slap on a sexy dashboard, and, you know, maybe it feels like interactive and intuitive. This is a tragedy. I call this the Sisyphean reporting cycle, right? Every month you gotta, like, roll that, or every quarter roll that reporting thing up the hill. And meanwhile, our tragic heroes, our data analysts, they're thinking about all these other things that they could ask of the data, including, anticipating some fire data drills. So what the Analytics Accelerator does is it says, okay, we're gonna do facilitated trainings, but also wraparound support and one-on-one consulting, because we found that, you know, one-on-one trainings aren't successful over the long term, and then champion internal development and capacity building across the department. And what this leads, it allows our departments to break out of this Sisyphean reporting cycle into automated, streamlined reporting, and that enables and essentially unlocks staff capacity to tackle those more impactful projects that leads to more robust analytics and includes training in these key data concepts that are needed in this world we're in now. The second service is something we call the Modern Data Stack Accelerator. And it's best to unpack this with an example. So Jason Lally on my team, who was CDO of, he took over after I left in San Francisco. And in early pandemic, you might have heard about this thing called PPE. Yeah, personal protective equipment. And he gets a call from the deputy city administrator, and they're like, we cannot track our supply of PPE. There's these 2 separate systems. Can your team help? And he's like, yeah, we can help. Basically, what was going on is PPE was being tracked by the Department of Public Health, and then separately the logistics unit, which is kind of like the team that helps with supplies during crisis. And there were a couple of problems, right? So they use different languages, right? You know, it was exam gloves versus nitrile versus medical. And they also counted differently. They used different units. So if you're, you know, trying to deploy PPE to save people's lives, and you have 2 systems that don't talk to each other, don't speak the same language, and count things differently, how do you optimally deploy your resources? So what the team did, and I'm not going to talk about this, that would be for a more technical audience, but basically they put in a bunch of glue, lightweight, cheap glue, that helped these 2 systems be translated and speak to each other. And what they were able to do was convert this multilingual system into a single count across the entire city and county. And guess what? They did it in 2 weeks. So, because also in the public sector, we love spending a lot of money and taking 5 years to do this. So there's many problems that it can solve. So that's taking data from two separate systems, right? It can be used for automating and data quality reporting, for moving larger data. You mentioned big data. In the public sector, we actually have mostly medium and small size data, but there are different tools and techniques you need to use the bigger your data gets. And then also, we just want to give departments often were pretty slow on the modern tools adoption curve. It allows them to play with new tools that can make their work easier and faster. So these two services are all about getting to that data on demand, right? Where you can, do stuff with your data, because we don't want data on demand to sort of then admire it. Look at that data on demand. No, we want to move to step 2, use data in decision making. And for me, this is really a menu of options. So some programs need to use techniques from performance management. This is really great for very predictable things like, how many widgets did we make yesterday? We made this many widgets. Did it meet our target? No, it didn't. That's performance management. Not all government services are like that, but it's an important set of tools for some things. Some things require experiments and evaluation, but the last one I'm going to talk about is advanced analytics or data science. And so the Data Science Accelerator is our last sort of service offering that we rolled out this year. And in my experience, one of the biggest blockers to the adoption of data science, machine learning, and AI approaches in the public sector is something called the truffle pig problem. So truffle pigs, truffles are this like delicacy. They're very expensive. And truffle pigs are adorable, as you can see, adorable little creatures that kind of sniff out the truffles, and they can sniff it, according to Wikipedia, always a great source, 4 to 6 feet below dirt, right? And what we found is that we had to sniff out good data science projects in the public sector. And you sort of knew you had a truffle pig problem if, people were like, can I have a dashboard? Oh my God, dashboards are still like overwhelmingly, and there's nothing wrong with dashboards, but one, our other service is for that, and you can learn to do it yourself. And two, a dashboard isn't helpful if you're not asking the right questions and monitoring the right data. Some people get confused and like, could you build us a warehouse of data, a repository, an archive? We're like, then maybe that's helpful, but that's not really what data science is. Or could you automate this process? And like, go talk to your IT shop. That's not really us. So our solution to this truffle pig problem was something we called the project topology. And so we essentially identified these classes of problems that instead of using data science terms like, that's an unsupervised learning algorithm and we'll use clustering, we're not going to talk to them like that. Instead, we're going to put the problems in their language so they can opportunity spot. So how it works is, I'll just give one example. Prioritize your backlog. So in this case, a department has an issue where they tackle their stuff first in, first out, FIFO. So a lot of departments do inspections, right? Like restaurant inspections. Departments do audits, like, did you file your tax thing correctly? Everyone's favorite. I guess you guys don't have to deal with that yet. Any number of things that case management, like cases, people are receiving services from your department. And essentially, they process it first in, first out. What we do from the data science perspective is we model their past and their current cases, and we identify groupings, and then essentially the service change is that they reshuffle based on their priority. It could be, these are the riskiest cases, these have the highest need, these are the greatest opportunity. But the end result, and whatever the prioritization scheme that makes sense for the department, is that they're addressing those high priority cases first. So an example of data science work we did in San Francisco was we had this question of that our assessor recorder came to us with a question. They said, hey, we have this giant backlog of property sales. And one of the things that you have to do with property sales, and what every county assessor does in the state of California, is they say, does that sale price match what we think the fair market value is? And why is this an important question? Well, first off, why is it a question? So imagine I'm Joy and I want to sell my house to my niece. Do you think I'm going to give her a deal? Yeah. Probably, right? But the way property tax law works in the state is we're supposed to charge your taxes based on if you sold that on the open market, what would you have gotten? And so we have to flag properties that maybe didn't sell at the right amount. And then why do we care about that? Because property taxes are the largest revenue for every local jurisdiction for their general fund dollars. This is a very important issue for every county. And so we had this big backlog, and our assessors were overwhelmed. There was, I think, about 44 assessors in the city and county of San Francisco, and they're all overwhelmed. We would sit down, we'd watch them do assessments. And this was also a big deal because it also affected our bond rating. So I remember sitting in bond rating sessions at the state of California, and they'd be like, what's going on with your property tax backlog? So long story short, we developed a series of models for them, and what we were able to spit out was the predicted price. It sold for this. We predicted it should have sold for that. And the service change we said was like, how did our predicted price compare to the actual sales price? And if it was in a certain range, we just went ahead and collected that revenue right away. And then if it was outside of the range, those are going to do a full assessment, right? And so the results from this was that the very first model run reduced the backlog by 10%, which allowed us to access $2.8 million in general fund revenue. So no discussion about data science would be complete without talking about ethics. And so what our team does is use essentially an ethics risk assessment, both before and after data science and machine learning modeling, to assess the equity in terms of how we're introducing our data science models. And if you are interested, you can read more about this approach. We have a blog series on it. So to summarize, we're empowering departments at every step, getting their data house in order, and then driving use of data in decision making. But I want to close with stepping way back. So we're here, you know. And I would like to ask, does anyone know what these companies have in common? I don't know if it's still true, but it was at the time I made this slide. They're all built on Amazon Web Services. This is not a pitch for Amazon. But the point is that in the public sector, including academia, we rebuild the same stuff over and over again with variable quality. We have no systematic approach to data infrastructure in the modernization of government. Every jurisdiction does their own little thing, willy-willy by nilly. And it begs the question, why do we keep repeating that same undifferentiated? It's not interestingly different across those sectors by domain, geography, and level of government. And so I think a larger policy question I would like us to have is, you know, I spent a lot of time working in the national lab space, which is a quasi-government world that has a lot more flexibility in doing work to tackle these big hard science problems. Why don't we explore a national government laboratory for improving and modernizing government services? And so looking forward to the conversation and questions, and thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for the great presentation again today. We appreciate you both. And again, the presentations will be available online at our UCCS website at uccs.ucdavis.edu, as well as the recording for the talk. Thank you.